Well, I was going to say, because the next point I was going to make was that farms are much closer in or mixed in with urban areas in Europe. So it's very common if you're in a major European city, you don't have to drive very far and be in farmland. Whereas here, for a whole variety of policies, that's not the case. Most U.S. cities are surrounded by miles and miles of suburbs, which are certainly not farms. And most farming is done in areas, because we have such a large land mass, far removed from where urban population centers. Another reason is that there is an extraordinary cultural history pertaining to food in Europe, which has not been maintained in this country by European immigrants. To some extent it has. Immigrants in other societies have an important, an elevated importance of food. But generally speaking, if you compare the norms in the U.S. and Europe, food in places like Italy and France and Spain and so forth occupies a much more important part of cultural life, social significance and so forth. The amount of time devoted to eating and food preparation, just on and on. You could just go on and on throughout the whole meaning of food in those cultures versus here. So there are lots of differences, all of which contribute, I think, to the difference in political consciousness and political dynamics around genetically engineered organisms. My own personal feeling, though, is that the proportional representation one is really, really important.
Yeah, they bring up some very important issues, and I know from my own personal experience too, as a practicing physician and treating patients from different cultures, that it was a very significant pleasure to be treating people who were coming from Europe or Eastern Europe, where they had this real strong understanding of the importance of food and how to prepare it, and
right.
Really it was very easy to have a discussion with them, whereas when you're treating a typical American, it was just a polar opposite.
But yeah, I mean, again, I want to also relate how this, make sure we understand that, or don't lose sight of the fact that this relates to the kind of entrenchment of certain power interests. If we look back a year ago about the debate in this country about health care, there are a number of reasons why every country in Europe and actually developed elsewhere have universal access to health, and we don't. And why it was so bitterly resisted here. And that's because certain centers of power here would not be able to maintain that advantage under, a different system. So the insurance companies have fought against the public option and stuff like that. Why don't we have Medicare for everyone the way they do in most European countries? And that's because people make a lot of money off medical stuff in this country, and we pay more per capita for a medical system which is not nearly as good as others, but we pay more per capita, and that's because we're paying all of these
we pay more
ancillary bodies.
We pay more than any other country in the world. I think it's somewhere in the mid $2 trillion.
So I think that gives you an example. Now, those systems with proportional representation, again, are just more sensitive to the ability. It actually relates to what we were saying before about paradigms and Kuhn and so forth. Does the overall system allow different points of view, different conclusions to grow and to, successfully compete, or does it squash them? And we're talking here about a number of situations, politically, economically, academically, et cetera, where the system is set up to sort of squash different points of view, as opposed to systems that might give them more breathing space and have some kind of a fair, let's have a battle of ideas here, So we're getting a little bit maybe away from the GE issue specifically, but I think this is the context within which these differences
No,
occur.
it's an important tangent because we primarily focus on the science and the health components, and we rarely take a look at the social and cultural and philosophical and or policy issues, which you're an expert at. So it's important to have this perspective to understand the broader picture of how these decisions are made, and with that understanding to even basically direct a more effective strategy at making a difference and changing
Yeah,
changing things.
thank you very much. I agree, of course, with that, and that's why I say that's why I started off at the beginning of this say let's not just demonize Monsanto. Monsanto is a bad actor. There's no doubt about it. But the problem, in my view, goes well beyond Monsanto. And that I don't say any of that to denigrate or to minimize the importance of some of the really bad things that Monsanto does and what it pushes. But that's not the whole story. And yeah, a lot of these institutional factors affect these outcomes very dramatically, even if we're not aware of them. Yeah, that's sort of what
There's a philosophical framework that allows these corporations like Monsanto to exist because
Well, that's the whole thing with like the Citizens United thing, which saying that they have these individual rights, a First Amendment right of free speech. I mean, that's nonsense. That's nonsense. There's actually a case in the Supreme Court, this thing where they're arguing that a corporation shouldn't have to release certain records because corporations have a right to privacy. Could you believe this? We'll next be giving them the vote. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's a whole ideological thing, even more than philosophically. To use the term philosophical sometimes puts people off. They think it doesn't relate to them. It's too pie in the sky or not relevant to the real nitty-gritty of the world. It is relevant to the nitty-gritty of the world, whether you call it philosophy or not. But I don't want to use terminology that makes people think that it's not relevant.
Sure. No, you have to communicate in an effective way. There's no question.
Yeah, because these are real things that have real impacts. Who gets a chance to vote? Who gets a chance to spend money, etc. Look at the labeling. We haven't talked about this, but the fact that almost every other country, even other countries that are rah-rah for GE, have labeling, and we don't have laws about labeling. We now have developed slowly over time practices in which foods in the supermarket might be labeled as not knowingly containing any genetically engineered or components and stuff like that.
It's not even that we don't have labeling. It is far worse. We have anti-labeling legislation, so that if a company claims the truth, which is this has no genetically modified organisms in it, it's clean, they have to put a warning label on it that says there's no difference between GMO and non-GMO.
Okay, you're not exactly accurate. We have no legislation about that. That is a guidance document from the FDA. It is not a law, but no one wants to expend the resources to try and challenge it, especially because the overarching ideology, which has been drummed into us for the past 25 years, is that there is no difference, and that it is. Now, in certain states, there were laws about agricultural disparagement, that if you made such a statement and couldn't back it up about an agricultural product, it could be like a libel or defamation, if you will, of the corn or whatever. This was, in terms of GMOs, what's relevant is that this really shut up a lot of producers. Again, it takes a lot of money and resources to try and challenge something like this, and you have no idea whether you'll be successful or not. But a number of years ago, I think it was the Illinois Department of Agriculture threatened to take Ben & Jerry's ice cream to court over their statements that they didn't use genetically engineered. They didn't use milk or cream from cows with that were injected with bovine growth hormone, recombinant DNA growth hormone. Ben and Jerry's was big enough and strong enough to be able to resist that, and they started to do that. And then once it was allowed, so the FDA said, yes, but you have to, it's misleading, that's the legal term, that the FDA has the power to prohibit misleading information. Even if it's factually true, something could be misleading in how it's presented. So this was their argument, and I guess Ben and Jerry's or no one, it would be so hard to challenge whether or not this is misleading or not. So that's when this guidance document from the FDA was officially put out, which said if you're going to state something about lack of GM ingredients, you have to put out that according to the FDA, there's no substantial difference between these things.
So even though it may not be law, it's effectively law because to challenge it, you'd have to go to court.
No, but I thought you said a specific statute. It's not a statute at all. Yeah. And yes, it has to be challenged, but it's much easier to challenge a guidance document then. And, and this is going to happen maybe eventually. But again, without the research being done, it would be very hard to prove in a court of law. And how do you, what kind of expert witnesses do you bring in when the industry has thousands of people willing to testify, right, that on the other side? So this is not an easy kind of thing. And the other point I want to make in terms of the statement you made, even if you look very carefully, no one, even with organic stuff, when the USDA first proposed the organic rules that would have allowed, among other absurdities, genetically engineered foods to be labeled organic. And 275,000 comments were sent in, the largest or second largest citizen response up until that time for any proposed regulation. And there were hearings. We forced them to have 3 hearings around the country, one of which was here in Seattle. And the organic rules, as finally promulgated, did not allow any genetically engineered foods. The problem is, and we haven't really talked about this, with contamination in the field, contamination in the processing, and all the rest of it. It's not actually possible for anyone to say this can contains no genetically engineered substances.
It's almost by design.
It's not physically possible anymore. Now, what you will find, and I do some work with a project called the No GMO Verification Project. We have developed a little label symbol, and it's being held out as available to processors, which basically says that there's been scientific verification of the fact that, 1, the manufacturer doesn't knowingly buy any engineered ingredients or contaminated ingredients, and 2, the processing is such that there's no reason to suspect that contamination is occurring. But you cannot say, and by the way, contamination is a intentional strategy. Maybe I should talk about this. An intentional strategy of both the government and the industry. We have statements to that effect.
Oh, sure, absolutely. No surprise on that.
No, well,